Welcome to our podcast series for business, brought to you by the Greater Fort Lauderdale Chamber of Commerce, the South Florida Business Council, the Greater Miami Chamber of Commerce, and the Chamber of the Palm Beaches. This is Dan Lindblade, President and CEO of the Greater Fort Lauderdale Chamber, and it gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce you all to one of my colleagues, the President and CEO of the Marine Industries Association of South Florida, Phil Purcell. Welcome, Phil.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me. I love these podcasts that you're doing, and it's very insightful for the business community.
Well, I appreciate that. Wanted to ask you at the front end, how are you doing, your family, your staff? Is everybody healthy? Just give me a sense for how you all are dealing with this from an organizational perspective.
Sure. So we kind of jumped earlier into being remote. So we probably did it about a week before anybody else had started it. And so the team is doing really well. And, you know, it's funny, the more you throw at them, the more they accomplish. So as you know, you're only as good as the people you surround yourself with. So the team, I think, has really benefited and found new strengths that they didn't know they had from a digital world. Family, knock on wood, everyone's doing great. And everyone's following the CDC guidelines and working remotely and all well.
Wonderful. That's so good to hear. Now, a lot of our listeners, Phil, may not even know about the Marine Industries Association. Why don't you share us, if you will, with your mission and what exactly you all do?
So this year, interesting, it's our 60th anniversary this year for the Marine Industry Association of South Florida. And so its mission is to advocate on behalf of the businesses, and that's the yards and the workers in the industry. When you think of the size and scope of what does the marine industry mean regionally, it's a $12 billion industry, as you know, and 142,000 people. But out of that 12 billion, 9 billion of it, 8.9 billion of it comes from Broward County and 112,000 people. So when you think statewide, which Florida is the #1 state for boating in the nation, statewide, it's about a $23.5 billion industry. So when you think regionally, again, Palm Beach to Miami and then Broward, the significance and size and scope of the industry here, it's like nowhere else in the world. And that's what the association does. It's also the owner of the Fort Lauderdale International Boat Show.
Let's talk about that for a second. I mean, everybody's talking about we're going to have football this fall. We're wondering whether or not we're going to bring our meetings back, how long it's going to take. Everybody's kind of iffy on actually having group gatherings because of the pandemic. What's your sense, and what are you doing to prepare for FLIBS, and how's that going to run this year?
So we're going to work with, obviously, governmental, follow CDC guidelines, work with local, state, and federal rules. But that said, when you think of FLIBS, when you think of the NHL teams or football teams or basketball teams, you have a scheduled event with X number of determined people that has a time they arrive, a time they go to the bathroom, and the time they leave. FLIBS is, it's 100,000 people over 5 days, over 7 sites, and those sites comprise just under 90 acres. So if you were to have, let's just divide it to 20,000 people a day, and you divide that over 7 sites, you're getting about 2,500 people per site. And so it's a very palatable, well exceeds CDC guidelines, just like boating does. And equally important, it's an outdoor event primarily. So nice thing about this, Dan, is, Fort Lauderdale is very fortunate. When Informa stepped in and acquired the promotional rights to the show, this show in Palm Beach and Miami also, amongst other shows, we got with that one of the greatest partners that's truly a global company in the UK, US, and in Asia. And so they're at the forefront in determining the guidelines so that convention centers can reopen. So the guidelines that'll be for convention centers, as an example, Informa will have been at the table the whole time working with Vegas and other large places that host large conventions on a regular basis. And they need them to come back for the employees that work in those areas. They're setting the guidelines for indoor events, and then we'll be able to apply it when you, again, do the math. People always talk about, hey, how much square footage of a store and how do you do this? And we'll be able to do that. We have over 27 access points to FLIBS as an example. So that combined with 90 acres and 7 sites, 100,000 people over 5 days is far different than an NFL event or an NBA event or a baseball game.
It still it has a lot of people, and there still will be concerns, but I'm sure you guys are going to be able to work those out. What are the dates, Phil? I don't recall what the
The
dates are.
28th this year, I believe, through the 3rd. You would think I'd have that right at the tip of my tongue, Dan, but it's a
Of
Thursday, I
October.
believe, is the 28th of October.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, we've been talking about everything from Tortuga Music Festival, which we postponed until right about the same time, earlier, a little earlier in October. I don't know if that's a much different footprint than FLIBS, but packed people in. Doesn't look like we're going to have any vaccine for this COVID-19 this year. At least that's what I've been reading. So all concerns, but for this International Boat Show, for our listeners, if they've never been to it, you must attend, because it is I would say the queen of boat shows, if you will, because you get all of the yachtsmen, all of the great manufacturers, all of the technology, and then talk a little bit about what you guys do also with your innovation, where you celebrate through some of the third-party organizations that you've brought in for innovation and technology, like the guy who created the battery that had this exceedingly long lifespan that you funded. Talk to them about that a little bit. I think that's
Sure. So, again, the neat thing about the show is the people that attend the show from all over the world have been following the guidelines very seriously. When you look at a lot of the attendees, and you look at our marinas here as an example, they're all either at 95 or 100% occupancy. And people have sheltered in place that have created great companies that are allowed to, which leads into the Marine Research Hub that, along with the Greater Fort Lauderdale Alliance and the 4 universities we started, which was to advocate and show some of the research and commercialize and monetize the research. So what we've done is, over time, we've partnered with Ocean Exchange, which is a 9-year-old event that's awarded over $1.7 million in prizes. And so this year, the past year that we just had it, we gave 2 $100,000 prizes away, and Broward College gave a $10,000 prize. And when you look at the people that applied from all over the world, it was boiled down to 12 people. And one of them, as an example, was a guy by the name of Nicholas Flanders. And so one of the people that's been quoted in this whole pandemic is a gentleman by the name of Bill Gates, which comes from the Northwest, right? And so Bill Gates Foundation. And so he is always looking at how to clean water, sanitation, vaccines. So here is Nicholas Flanders, who won the $100,000 prize. And what he does is return CO2 emissions back into fuel. And so when you think of jets, boats, everything, it's amazing. But what was really interesting is, prior to him showing up for Ocean Exchange at FLIBS this year, you go and look in their bios a little bit, and there was Bill Gates in his lab, Dan, think about that. And so that's something that our university should be hoping that we get a Jeff Bezos or a Bill Gates or Eric Schmidt into our facilities, so that we can showcase amazing research that's being here. And that's why we did the Marine Research Hub, was to help the universities connect to the entrepreneurs and the family offices that ultimately can influence South Florida in terms of creating jobs.
We're talking to Phil Purcell, President and CEO of the Marine Industries Association of South Florida. Phil, let's switch gears for a second and talk about some of the reaction or the experiences that the marine industry and all of its sectors has seen during this pandemic. Which has been the hardest hit in your eyes at this point?
So anything with retail obviously was hit when it was, people coming in and shopping in a store in a direct purchase environment. Our industry got hurt there. The nice thing about it is our yards continued to work, however, and so they're essential businesses. So when you think of aviation, like Fort Lauderdale owns Executive Airport, and you think of the FBOs around Fort Lauderdale International, those things, they continued to work through the pandemic, as did our industry. You can't mothball a 150-foot boat or a 180-foot boat. And then equally important, the crew, Dan, that reside on these boats, that's their home. And so what happened when this pandemic started taking place, all the yacht owners, knowing that Fort Lauderdale is the refit hub of the world, the yachting capital of the world, they had their boats returned to South Florida. And so we worked very closely with Customs Border Protection and the Coast Guard so the boats could return. And if you look at our marinas now, and you look, I think you saw, if you watched the NFL draft a week or two ago, you would have saw Jerry Jones. Well, his boat has been berthed down in Miami, for the last 2 months, just about a month and a half. And so they use that as a place of refuge, but equally important, they follow the strictest guidelines in terms of CDC guidelines so that their crew and everyone remains safe. And so the crew in our industry, however, have been harmed. And so what happens is when the owners of companies that can acquire these things, often they sit there and say, okay, I got to focus on my business now for the next couple of years. Sometimes they go ahead and make some adjustments of crew in terms of size and scope. And so they got hit, our retail got hit, our yards, knock on wood, they need to reopen so they can be fully operational. But they've been essential businesses that have been operating through this. But I think we'll see some layoffs also. The sales side, you got to look to, in automotive, you look to an AutoNation. In our industry, you look to a company called MarineMax, which is a Florida company, publicly traded. And they're having probably one of their best March and Aprils because they've been following well before this pandemic. They've been using AI, they've been using digital platforms. And so this was just a perfect way for them to segue into that and still continue sales. Because no matter what we're in, as you know, nothing happens till somebody sells something. And so we're working through it as an industry, but we're a strong industry. We'll come out of it stronger.
Indeed. I suspect that you'll be one of the industries that really drive us out of this pandemic and reacting quickly. I noticed that when the executive orders came through, and I stopped counting at about 47 executive orders, but I noticed when they decided to open the boat ramps throughout South Florida and the long lines occurred, people were getting back on the water. They were really excited about using their personal watercraft. What do you think the tale of the tape is for the recreational boater industry as it relates to this?
So, recreation is 2% of the GDP, whatever the GDP ends up being. But boating, as you know, we're the #1 state for boating. And it is, as you heard, some of the different committees that we both sat on, you hear from everyone when they go home at night and they had whether they were working remotely and sat on a Zoom call all day, they got on their boat at about 5 or 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock that night. And they went for a ride and decompressed with their spouse, their kids, whoever it was that was close to them, that was, sheltering with them. And so the boat ramps and stuff was that was something that happened more in a Dade County perspective than a Broward perspective. When you look at shoreline access, Dade County's rich in shoreline access that goes from Holliver all the way down to Black Point, which, Homestead. And all their waterfront is primarily not seawalled in terms of access point. And so you can literally launch your boat and be standing at a sandbar, which created all these rafting things, which the optics were taking on people and rafting and stuff. And so a few bad apples, that got populated by the media. The reality of it is Broward County doesn't have that problem. We have 2 sandbars. We don't have public marinas that have boat launch ramps next to them. Again, when you look at marinas in Fort Lauderdale, it's Pier 66, Bahia Mar, Las Olas Marina. They're not launching boats. And equally important, they really tightened up everything, not even allowing Amazon on their docks to deliver packages for the people that did, and the crews that sheltered in place. So, the boat ramps, I'm glad they're open. Again, our leadership in our community, we're very fortunate. You work with them every day, but the mayor, the commissioners, both. So, recreation is 2% of the GDP, whatever the GDP ends up being. But boating, as you know, we're the #1 state for boating. And it is, as you heard, some of the different committees that we both sat on, you hear from everyone when they go home at night and they had whether they were working remotely and sat on a Zoom call all day, they got on their boat at about 5 or 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock that night. And they went for a ride and decompressed with their spouse, their kids, whoever it was that was close to them, that was, sheltering with them. And so the boat ramps and stuff was that was something that happened more in a Dade County perspective than a Broward perspective. When you look at shoreline access, Dade County's rich in shoreline access that goes from Holliver all the way down to Black Point, which, Homestead. And all their waterfront is primarily not seawalled in terms of access point. And so you can literally launch your boat and be standing at a sandbar, which created all these rafting things, which the optics were taking on people and rafting and stuff. And so a few bad apples, that got populated by the media. The reality of it is Broward County doesn't have that problem. We have 2 sandbars. We don't have public marinas that have boat launch ramps next to them. Again, when you look at marinas in Fort Lauderdale, it's Pier 66, Bahia Mar, Las Olas Marina. They're not launching boats. And equally important, they really tightened up everything, not even allowing Amazon on their docks to deliver packages for the people that did, and the crews that sheltered in place. So, yeah, the boat ramps, I'm glad they're open. You know, again, our leadership in our community, we're very fortunate. You work with them every day, but the mayor, the commissioners, both on the city and on the county side, did a tremendous job advocating and making sure our industry remains strong, because again, you can't mothball. When you look at a 150-foot boat, it is electric and sewage, just like a big house. It needs to be maintained, a roof, everything else, and people live there on these boats. So I really have to applaud our local politicians for everything they did to make sure that our industry continued working in a safe environment.
Federal level, and your team works very well on the state level. Kelly Skidmore, former representative in the House on your team, doing a great job with the Ocean Exchange as well. What are you hearing about special session, budget? How's that going to impact you? And anything on the federal level you'd like to touch on as well?
So Patience in our office, Patience Khan, you know, works very closely on the state and federal level with Customs Border Protection, Coast Guard, a lot of the issues, the seen, unseen. We're very fortunate, again, as a community, that Ted Deutsch was appointed to the federal reopening by the President of America. And so there's some issues there that are real opportunities too. So you look, I think our state sales tax revenue, I think I heard this morning, was down $780 million, if I'm not mistaken. And so you over the last 45, 60 days. And so charters and stuff, again, a lot of the boats that normally would have gone over to Europe, et cetera, have now remained in the U.S. There's a tremendous opportunity, Dan, for people to charter in the Northeast or go to the Bahamas and stuff, but equally important, remain stateside, where states could collect those, whatever their sales tax is in New York or Massachusetts, they could collect those fees that, you know, range from 7 to 9% depending on sales tax. And that would go in the state's coffers. So those are some of the things we're advocating for. That Ted Deutsch is also helping us in reference to that. He's also working on when you think of Trade Show Relief Act, which is, would like to see get in there, because, you know, as the Broward County Convention Center comes back on, you know, they're going to need to bring trade shows back in here, as does Palm Beach and Miami, et cetera, and Orlando. And so they may not be boat show directives, but it will work with them also, so that exhibitors can come, spend money, feel safe. And that's where Informant comes in, creating these standards for CDC guidelines, et cetera, of what facilities will look like. But the federal level, we've been very successful on different things, working on the state level, foreign trade zones, which was a federal and state initiative that has given us an advantage that, again, came from the city of Fort Lauderdale and from FXE. By partnering with them, they helped us get our first ever marine foreign trade zone in the country done. You know, one of the things we also have on the state level is the funding for the Marine Research Hub. And so it's easy to swipe at things and take it away, but these are the opportunities to create jobs down the road. When you have the ear of a Ray Dalio, who's one of the greatest investors of all time, Bridgewater Associates, and he is in the space of oceanographic research, you know, we need to make sure that our universities can commercialize and monetize the research, whether they're working on cures for pancreatic cancer, or even as simple as, we don't need to ban sunscreen, Dan, but maybe we need to take the chemicals out that harm the reef, that protects our real estate, and again, the outdoor recreation, what it means, diving, fishing, boating. Those are those core jobs that, again, primarily work through some of this also. And so that's why we did that Salty Jobs series too, and partnered with Atlantic Technical for the first ever yacht technician program, that these kids can come out, maybe they don't go on to college, they go right into the yacht technician program, and they'll get out making between 40 and 60. So again, what's the state average wage? 47, I think.
Correct.
And so our industry has all those career opportunities that require physical labor. And again, knowing that we're going to grow 6 million people, knowing there's a 5% conversion rate of population to boaters, I think we got a healthy future. And it helps with our electeds championing that.
Well, we are so lucky to have you at the helm of our Marine Industries Association, and the great staff that you guys have over there, and really driving our economy from the marine industry's perspective. You do such a great job. Thank you so much for being on today, Phil.
Thanks for having us. And again, you're only as good as people we surround ourselves with, and I'm fortunate to have a great team. Thank you.
This is Dan Lindblade, and you have been listening to Podcast Series for Business, brought to you by the Greater Fort Lauderdale Chamber of Commerce, the South Florida Business Council, the Greater Miami Chamber of Commerce, and the Chamber of the Palm Beaches. Stay tuned for more Podcasts for Business.